this chapter almost didn't appear in the book. I actually was the last chapter I added. Wasn't clear that it was going to fit. Um, uh, but the yin yang symbol that comes from the 3rd century BC China philosophy is that these kinds of opposites really give us insight into how the world works. So the yin yang symbol shows that darkness and light are each necessary for either to exist. Without light, there's not darkness. Without darkness, there's not light. And so the dark part of the yin yang has the light in it, and the light has the dark in it. And it's meant to suggest that these things are connected rather than isolated. And so in the Blue Marble evaluation logo, we have a yin yang symbol that runs across the green yin yang across the globe. The other thing about our logo, if you look carefully at it, is that we have put all of the continents on the one side of the earth. So that's what photoshopping lets you do, I guess. And so the part of the meaning of the green yin yang symbol on the logo is to integrate the humanity and nature, people and earth. But just by way of context, there are lots of polarities that we deal with all the time: bottoms up, top down, quantitative, qualitative, short-term, long-term, critical thinking versus creative thinking, pessimism versus optimism. And today, this very day, August 27th, 1770, is the birthday of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who said we learn from history that we do not learn from history, which is foreboding. But Hegelian dialectics was a form of logic that involved working back and forth between opposites to arrive at an evolved consciousness. So that in being and nothing, going back and forth between those concepts, logically, you arrive at a synthesis. And he developed a form of logical argument in which we pose a thesis, look at the antithesis, and arrive at a synthesis. He distinguishes his logic from that of Plato, which was also a form of dialectic. In Plato's writings, he had Socrates having the Socratic dialogue in which Socrates would pose a position and then the others would question and counter that position, and they would work back and forth between the initial premise that Socrates had posed and then the responses, the counter premises to that, to arrive at an understanding of the premise itself. There's a book by Kelso and Engstrom that called The Complementary Nature, which is about integrating different dichotomies as a way of understanding. So they take things like the individual and the collective, self and other, body and mind, nature and nurture, cooperation and competition, and examine, again, from a yin yang perspective, how each of those is necessary to make sense of the other, but that the middle ground of harmonizing them gives us more insight than simply staying with the original contrast. And they nominate the tilde or the squiggle as the symbolic punctuation for reconciled complementaries. So you see here that it's individual tilde, collective, self tilde other, body tilde mind, nature tilde nurture, cooperation squiggle competition, as a way of showing a kind of yin yang connection among them. So we are at a time of polarization and of in many different fronts. I'm going to review a few and then invite your addition and thoughts about which ones are important, which can be resolved, which are actually perhaps unresolvable. And then I want to turn to the challenge of integrating environmental concerns and social justice concerns, which have been often at practical organizational advocacy and logical opposites, and examine that from a blue marble perspective. So two-eyed seeing contrasts with the polarization between science and politics. Two-eyed seeing comes from the McMock group in Canada. Elder Albert Marshall has posed what he calls integrative science as a way of integrating opposites, and scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge is one of those opposites. There's some wonderful videos of Albert on YouTube describing two-eyed seeing as referring to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. Elder Albert indicates that two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspectives treasured by many Aboriginal peoples. We believe, he said, it is a requisite guiding principle for the new consciousness needed to enable integrative science work, as well as other integrative or transcultural or transdisciplinary or collaborative work. One of the classic polarities that has been an evaluation from the beginning is comes from an article that Carol Weiss did, a classic in the field of evaluation, between use tests and truth tests. And indeed, when the principles and standards for evaluation, the Joint Committee on Standards, which includes both use criteria and accuracy criteria, and standards have gone through 3 revisions, whether the use criteria or the accuracy criteria, the truth test in a way, should appear first, what the order of the standards should be. And Stuffelbeam, who chaired the standards committee, was adamant that use should appear first, that until you've dealt with what's possibly useful, accuracy doesn't really come in to the picture. And then you have to attune accuracy to utility. And what Carol Weiss found in her article on truth test versus use test was, of course, that policymakers want both. And that part of our challenge as evaluators is integrating concerns about use and concerns about truth. Another challenge is the different time horizons we deal with: short-term, medium-term, long-term. One of the principles of blue marble evaluation is the global principle, looking at the relationship between local and global, zooming in to look at what's going on at the immediate time and locally, zooming out to see the big picture. And as evaluators, we end up balancing optimism and pessimism, the good news and bad news, and trying to make sense of how these different perspectives inform each other. Of course, humans versus nature is one of our classic polarizations and dichotomies, and the effort of blue marble evaluation, a core to global thinking, is the integration of those, integrating economic, social, environmental concerns. And the life of humanity, the environment and Earth. Lots of work these days on integrating people, planet, and profit around sustainability. And all of these flow from recognizing that we create these differences. The conceptualization of truth versus a post-truth world. The struggle between facts, evidence, truth, data, reality, and thinking versus post-truth, fake news, alternative facts, make-believe, groupthink, and distortions, part of our political polarization. The traditional normal practice of evaluation, which involves logic models, having a project focus, SMART goals, is up against a post-normal evaluation in which we're dealing with complexity and dynamic changes and rapid responses. And the challenge of neutrality yields in blue marble evaluation to skin in the game. And we'll be discussing that chapter, but that we have a stake in the future of the environment and in social justice, for example. Things we know versus things we don't know. How do we deal with those relationships? In evaluation, we deal with the challenge of people being told what they want to hear versus being told the truth, of people lined up to be told what they want to hear, and a very small line lined up to hear the truth. And so we, as blue marble evaluators, part of what the blue marble perspective is about is crossing silos, crossing geographies, integrating across the local and the global, across different sectors. And that involves distinguishing in times what are the simple issues that are direct, immediate, short-term, local, more complicated issues with lots of parts, lots of people, lots of stakeholders, and of course, the complex, where we're not in control, where we're dealing with lots of uncertainty and the challenges of a chaotic world. So I'm going to invite you to go to Menti.com and get some input from you about the ways in which this is a feedback mechanism that allows us to so if you go to Menti.com and enter in the code 641319.4, 641319.4, you can enter in what you consider priority polarizations that need harmonizing. What are some polarizations that you encounter that you think deserve integration, yin yang, complementary pairs? So go to Menti.com, enter 641319.4, and then these, your polarizations will appear on the screen. Give you a minute to log in there. Is it showing up for people? There we go. Here it comes. Environment versus economy, consumer versus being a human.
Can you share your, are you wanting us to see the answers? You have to share a different screen if you want us to see.
Yes. Oh, I see. All right. Sorry.
We can't see it right now. Yeah.
All right, then, thank you. I'm still learning how to use this stuff. Now, are you seeing it?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, so there's one response. Do we have others? Your priority polarizations for harmonizing. No other takers?
I submitted something, but it doesn't seem to have appeared.
There it is. There it is. Humans as part of nature. Humans as apart from nature. Individual versus collective. All right. Then let's go to a second. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Here's the one I wanted. What yin yang opposites cannot be harmonized?
You might have to refresh your screen because it didn't refresh for you.
So you're not seeing that?
I am now, but at first it wasn't, so I just had to click refresh on my browser and then it popped up.
Okay. All right. So what yin yang opposites cannot be harmonized, if any? No? Then let's try this as a final entry. What yin yang contrasts are important in your world, whether they need to be integrated or not, but what kind of polarizations are you encountering in the world? What kind of opposites are important in your work, life, world? I've reviewed some as we got started. Which ones are big for you? Violent protests and peaceful protests. Yeah, that's a biggie. Social justice and environmental sustainability, divide between humans and nature. Great. So that's where we're going to go here, is back to you seen my slides again?
Yep.
This issue of sustainability and Prague Declaration that the International Development Evaluation Association passed last October is 10 items on it. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's an important read. And it calls for all evaluations to address sustainability. It says in all evaluations, we commit to evaluating for social, environmental, and economic sustainability and transformation, including by assessing contextual factors and systemic changes. we commit to assessing and highlighting in all evaluations unintended negative social and environmental effects. And so the field of evaluation, and Beverly's certainly been a leader in this, is paying attention to sustainability. We've got an issue of climate change adaptation. George Jonas edited a volume on evaluating sustainability in 2019 that I have a chapter in. The Canadian Evaluation Society is revising its strategic plan and making environmental sustainability a guiding principle. And in some ways, the battle of our time is between sustainability and equity concerns. The Equitable Evaluation Initiative, which is calling for all evaluations to address equity. And the principles that Beverly chaired the revision of have as a common good and equity, evaluators strive to contribute to the common good and advancement of an equitable and just society. So we have both of these principles that all evaluations should address sustainability. All of them should address equity and a visionary evaluation, and her book that's come out by that title. And environmental justice is one of the ways that that's being talked about. The George Floyd social justice uprising includes people paying attention to how climate change, as does COVID, highlight the disparities around social justice. And so we're starting to see people marching for both climate and justice and the economy. So the Seattle University Center has created a Center for Environmental Justice. This is one of the images of especially affected by the climate change. Stand with frontline communities in our fight for environmental justice against. And so there's an increased consciousness of how these issues are linked. This is a cartoon showing FEMA's guide to avoiding disaster. Gather up emergency rations of food, water, and clothing, move to a rich white neighborhood. And the intergenerational or disproportionately in places that are polluted and have poor air, poor water. So this quote from the Environmental Justice Group: the color of your skin or the thickness of your wallet shouldn't determine your ability to breathe clean air. And the dying words of George Floyd, "I can't breathe," has taken on a larger meaning. Our breath is individual, but breathing includes being in institutions where we feel we can take our breath. And so what I want to invite us is your thoughts, comments, and your questions about environmental justice as a yin yang integration of sustainability and equity. What you're seeing out there, how you're thinking about this, where we are as evaluators. How do we move the profession to include as universal criteria both equity and sustainability? Your thoughts, your reactions, what you're seeing out there, anything you care to share?
Well, I think what was helpful talk that, or the Blue Marble evaluation, one of the groups that you had maybe a couple months ago, was thinking about how these issues play out in all sorts of evaluations. So ones that you might not think are focused around, let's say, equity or sustainability, how those factors can be brought in, even into, you know, an after-school program, or you know, the program I brought up was a court foster care a court restorative justice program. So I think seeing how they relate, the everyday programs that we work with, or projects, even if they're not, you know, complex systems or more complex programs, or efforts, initiatives, seeing the relevance and thinking about that. So for me, that's been something to consider. So I appreciate that.
One
Thanks,
of
John.
the ones that I like is the work done by the Climate Justice Alliance, and they contrast. Well, they talk about it in terms of the economy, but I think you can talk about it broadly, and it has to do with extractive versus regenerative ways of living. And when they talk about extractive, they talk about extracting from nature and also extracting from people, in the colonization and slavery and so on, for the wealth of a few people and for power, versus a caring position of regeneration of both human and natural life, so that there's well-being for all, both social and with nature.
In my work in evaluation, I find that most sustainability evaluations are still following the traditional OECD definition of the parameter, you know, the criterion of sustainability, which is largely to look at whether the results of a program or project will persist in the future. It doesn't have to do with what one might call sustainable development evaluation, which is the balance between ecological integrity, social equity, and economic effectiveness. And that is what I think is clearly required, but we are not making that shift. And unless that is put in the TORs of an evaluation, then you end up using the traditional way of doing sustainability evaluation, which comes nowhere near what we are talking about. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I have an article coming out in the American Journal of Evaluation, probably in November. I think it's going to appear, offering alternative criteria for to the DAC criteria for evaluating transformation, and their use of the word sustainability is a problem in that regard. They kind of, as you suggested, co-opted that term, which simply means continuity from a funder's point of view, is whatever they paid for being maintained, rather than environmental sustainability or ecological sustainability. I ended up reframing that criterion as adaptive sustainability, the capacity to adapt to changes in climate and humanity, like COVID. That in fact the DAC criterion is quite static in that regard, because its basic paradigm is you begin with one baseline, and then there's an intervention, and you get to a new status, and then that status gets maintained. That's a very static view, as opposed to a adaptive sustainability that can adjust to changes in environment and changes in the human world and those in relationship to each other. So I very much agree, and we'll be doing when that article comes out, we'll do another webinar. I've done one on the alternative criteria to the DAC criteria, and we'll do that again once I know what the date is for the appearance of that article. And that I should add that in that the DAC criteria have 6 criteria, which are sort of traditional evaluation criteria of um, effectiveness, efficiency, impact. They've added coherence, sustainability that's already there. And in the alternative criteria for evaluating sustainability, then I've included both adaptive sustainability in the environmental sense and equity as a explicit criteria. The, that both of those need to be addressed following the recommendations that have come out of our respective professional associations. Beverly, when you all were revising the principles, I know you had some discussion of whether to add sustainability as the criterion. Are you at liberty to tell us about that discussion?
Sure. Well, thanks for asking about that. Actually, it's buried in there, and it's in the definition of common good, and that was the place where we ended up getting it. And it was largely, well, there were lots of things that went into it not being a big one, but there was so much that we had to do in getting the guiding principles that in the former form into one that was more manageable. We ended up leaving it, or well, creating that definition of common good. I don't know if you can find the glossary if you have that in front of you, but you'll see in there explicit comments about nature and so on. So my hope is that we can move that into a more prominent place in the next revision, which should be coming up soon, since it's practically 5 years since that was done.
Wow. Yeah, I think that the the field has not really yet embraced the implications of these two criteria, equity and environmental sustainability, as being relevant to all evaluations.
Last edition in 2008,
We just lost your sound, I think. Michael, I think we lost your sound. Are others hearing him, or is it just me?
No, I can't hear him.
Okay. Let me
Right.
see what I can see. Oh, there we
Am I
go.
back?
Yeah, you're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Let me, okay. So what I was saying is, where Charmaine and I are revising utilization-focused evaluation. The last edition, fourth edition, was in 2008. Essentials came out in 2015. And the biggest change in the new edition, which would be the fifth edition coming out next year, is up until the present time, what the criteria are for an evaluation have always been a matter of negotiation with the intended users. And that having criteria and being explicit about them was what the evaluator brought to the table, but not which criteria intended users should adopt. That's now different under our current global emergency, is that we have an obligation to be more active in advocating that the equity and sustainability are explicitly criteria for all evaluations. That's a huge shift in our role, and it obviously comes from the nature of the crisis in both social justice and environment. But that will be a major change for how utilization-focused evaluation is framed. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions?
Michael, do you intend to use your article once it's printed as a tool for advocating maybe that donors change how they write, or commissioners change the way they write terms of reference? Is there going to be some kind of, from Blue Marble's perspective, some kind of advocacy or push for it?
It's a great question. Thank you. And indeed, we've already started doing some of that. I made a presentation on the criteria at the International Development Evaluation Association, and several people commented on the need for that. And so I'm actually doing a course on Blue Marble evaluation coming up for the International Program and Development Evaluation Training, which is now going to be entirely virtual. And a major exercise with the participants, it's got about 30 participants in that course. A major exercise we're going to take on is how to frame these issues for the commissioners of evaluation, how to put them in terms of reference. That will be one of the exercises that we take on with people who are in that world and who experience that. So that's one of the products that I'm hoping comes out of that course, and will be ready to use when the article comes out, which is part of the justification for that. I had some discussion with the DAC folks as their revised criteria were coming forward. And in their, they have a Q&A that accompanies the traditional DAC criteria. And one of the questions that they take on is whether or not the traditional DAC criteria are relevant for evaluating transformation. And we'd had a discussion in which they agreed, so that we weren't at loggerheads, so that the alternative criteria I'm posing and their criterion, instead of being in competition, were more in a yin yang sense, where they're acknowledging that their criteria are more aimed at projects and programs, and that if you're talking about systems transformation, you may need some additional criteria. They, like Beverly said with the AEA principles, their notion of evaluating transformation is kind of buried in the impact criterion of DAC, that impact includes transformation, but they acknowledge that it is included in a weak form, that the way impact is defined is more traditionally in terms of linear logic models and more simple kinds of constructs. And for real systems change, that alternative criteria may be needed. So as we roll out the alternative criteria, we're going to be trying to find some common ground by saying they address, in some ways, different kinds of evaluation purposes, different kinds of interventions, and that as increasingly funders are concerned about systems change, systems transformation, environmental systems, systemic racism, moving from projects and programs to systems change, that in fact the DAC criteria are not appropriate for those. And they're appropriate for projects and programs more so than for genuine systems change. And therefore that will keep us from being in a loggerheads kind of situation, but saying for systems transformation, here are a different set of criteria that go beyond the program and project criteria of DAC. And we will certainly address terms of reference, commissioning evaluations with the new criteria. Thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
Michael, can I raise a question about that? You know, you talked about their criteria being more for projects and programs. and the other ones being for system transformation. What it seems like is not explicit is if you're doing those programs and projects, you're very likely to be just simply reinforcing the existing system. And it's the consciousness of what system you're enforcing. It's sort of like if you're not anti-racist, you're racist. So I'm trying to see how people who are doing projects and programs can recognize the very system that they are working within. There's always a system. It's whether you recognize which one you're working in and if you're reinforcing it versus helping to move it in some new direction.
That point's well taken. And in the article, I make the case that the revision process that they went through, this was the first revision in 30 years, and they did a wide consultation with international evaluators, most of whom overwhelmingly agreed that the DAC criteria should not be changed. They were working, that they met their needs. Of course, these are people who use the criteria, who know them, who are in that system, who are comfortable with that system. And so they said, let's not change the criteria. And so the DAC folks added the new criterion of coherence, which is trying to have those projects and programs be consistent with other interventions that may be going on, but that is still within the existing system. And in the article, what I argue is that they really have assumed in the revision a business as usual world, that in 30 years, nothing has changed about the nature of interventions and the kind of criteria that evaluators ought to use to evaluate those. And so being a little bit trying to be not overly provocative or politically hostile, I say something to the effect that if you believe that nothing has changed of significance in the world in the last 30 years, then the DAC criteria are probably still appropriate for you. If you believe that the world has changed significantly and that the climate emergency and the social justice crisis, environment and equity are major looming demands for major system change and a different way of doing business, then the DAC criteria are not going to be relevant and you're going to need some other criteria. So it's sort of inviting them to think about what their business as usual world is like. That is, it's both conservative in the criteria themselves, and I agree with you that those criteria are reinforcing the status quo in the things they look at. This is especially true, for example, of efficiency. The efficiency criterion is a straight input-output closed system efficiency definition. And the alternative that I pose in the alternative transformation criteria is a full cost accounting criterion. That the externalities of costs, like the environment, the effects on poverty, the effects on disparities, when you're talking about cost benefit in a closed input-output system, that's a very different calculation than to look at the effects of interventions beyond the immediate project outcomes. And a good example of that is that a major justification that the Trump administration has been using to roll back environmental regulations has been that they interfere with the efficiency of business. That complying with regulations undermines the efficiency of the business world. And that is a closed system measure of efficiency. that only calculates the cost of compliance against the profit of an enterprise and doesn't look at social costs, environmental costs, and human costs. So that criterion, I think, is not only supporting the status quo, but actually may be viewed as doing harm. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Then thank you all for being a part of this. Our next Blue Marble Book Club is on, I had a slide for it now and I've lost it. It's the end of September. I forget the exact day now. It's the Monday of the last week of September, whatever that turns out to be. And we'll be looking at bricolage methods. The question that regularly comes up around Blue Marble is what are the methods? And so we'll talk some about the methodological bricolage, how to draw upon multiple things. September 30th, I'm being told by Charmaine, entered into the chat box. So thank you all for joining us today. I've appreciated the opportunity to engage with you on Hegel's birthday, about how we engage in harmonizing yin yang polar opposites in cases. And we'll carry on from there. Thank you. Bye-bye.